Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in the country. We're excited to talk with you today about the President's budget proposal specific to the TANF program. And before I dive in, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. We've got TANF administrators from our tribal TANF programs and from states all across the country. And I want to give a special shout out to our friends in Alaska and Hawaii, because I know it's really early where you are. So thank you for getting up so early to join us. I promise I'm going to try to keep it upbeat and exciting and make it worth your while. So I wanted to go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to actually start out by kind of placing our TANF proposals in context of the President's fiscal year 17 budget. I wanted to start out by saying, actually sort of quoting to you a little bit from some of the language in the President's introduction to the budget, particularly around the issues that are germane to our office, which is that in the 21st century global economy, our competitiveness depends on tapping the full potential of every American. So even as we've rebounded from what is probably the worst economic crisis in our lifetime, you all know this well around the country, that too many families still struggle to reach the middle class and to stay there, and too many kids face obstacles on the path to success. And so improving the economic opportunity and economic security for poor children and families is both a moral and an economic imperative. And so that's just by way of framing our budget and a proposal, and I hope that you will see kind of that reflected in some of the ideas that we've put forward. And I wanted to just cover, you'll see here on the slide, a few themes that you'll see reflected throughout our proposals. This is perhaps, the most robust TANF proposal I think we've had since 1996 when the original legislation was passed. We're 20 years into the implementation, and so we really feel like it is this time for a fresh look, to look at what's working and to look at what can be improved. And so some of the themes that you'll see reflected, first, and I think this will be, something that folks on this call will really appreciate, we're proposing increased resources and along with that increased accountability. And we'll get into more of the specifics, but particularly I want to highlight, we're proposing $10 billion in new resources over the next 5 years. So that's very significant. And then second, we've got a number of proposals to really refocus the program on its core intention around economic stability and around employment. And then related to that, really trying to bring a more concentrated and renewed focus to addressing child and family poverty. And that's an area that I think we can all agree that we need and want to do more on, to make more progress on than we've been able to make in the last 20 years. And then finally, we're an evidence-based administration, and so we've got some proposals that build on evidence, but also leave room for innovation. And we know a lot of innovation comes from states and from tribes, and so we've got some new ideas around that that we want to share with you. So we'll sort of talk through some of the specific proposals related to these big themes, and I hope that you'll see we've really tried to take a close look at the data and what are the trends that we've seen over the last 20 years, and use that data to derive each of these proposals. So you'll see on the chart that you see, that the background that the slide, it says the value of the TANF block grant has decreased significantly. And what you see here is, I think, something that many of you across the country know well, that the TANF block grant has been at the same level since 1996. It's been at $16.5 billion. And that it's been 20 years, and the real value has decreased by 32%. The cost of living has increased, but the block grant has not kept pace with inflation. And so, if you go to the next slide, what we're proposing to address this is to increase resources and along with that increase accountability. And so I mentioned at the beginning $10 million in new resources. So $8 billion of that would actually be for an increase in the block grant level. It would be over 5 years, and in the first year, in FY17, it would be an increase of $750 million, and then each year subsequent to that, there would be a little bit more money, and so each year, the amount of the increase would go up, and it would go up to $2.25 billion of an increase in FY 2021. In addition, as we look at, the current context, and when we propose new money, it's always important to look at sort of current spending and think about what's the best way to allocate resources. And so what we put forward in the budget is that one way to allocate those new resources would be on a formula based on something such as state share of children in poverty. And we highlight that because we know from the data, and we know from all of you, that some states in particular over the last 20 years have seen significant increases in child poverty. Others have seen decreases. So we think it's important to take a look at that in allocating new resources. And then along with the increased federal resources, the state's basic maintenance of effort, or MOE requirement, would also increase by the same percentage increase in the block grant to a particular state. And then for our tribal TANF programs, for tribal TANF family assistance grants, those would also increase by the same proportion as the increase in the associated state family assistance grants. So for our tribal TANF partners, as you all know, that funding is linked to the funding available to states. So that's about the increases. We'll get a little bit more into the accountability in the next few slides. So on the issue of, proposing new spending, I mentioned it's important to take a look at what the current context is and how are the current dollars that are available being spent. And so this pie chart that you see will look familiar to many of you. We've had it posted on the OFA homepage for some time now. And what you can see is that, for TANF, for something that I think many people think of as the nation's welfare to work program, just under 50% is being spent on the kinds of activities that people traditionally think of as welfare to work, or what we describe in our budget proposal as the core benefits and services under TANF. And those are sort of on the right side of the pie chart, the blue pieces of the pie. So basic assistance, work-related activities, and childcare. And what you can see in the pie chart is that right now, when we look at federal and MOE spending, only about a quarter of the funds are going to basic assistance, primarily cash assistance, monthly cash assistance to families, and less than 7% of the resources are going to work-related activities, to employment and training activities, which we know, really is the heart of what it takes to connect families to employment. And so I think that's just important context for the proposals that we have put forward. And then if you look at the next slide, what it shows you is there's quite a fair amount of variation across states. So the previous slide was a pie chart for the nation. This map is something that's also available on our website. It's a clickable map, which you can take a look at, which will link to individual pie charts on spending state by state. And there's pretty wide variation, but you can see in the color-coded map there are some states that are spending greater than 50% of their resources on these core benefits and services, and then there are other states that are spending far less. So going to the next slide, our proposal is really to refocus the program on economic stability and employment, and this is where we get into the accountability issue that I mentioned. Along with the increase in resources, we're proposing to set a minimum threshold for spending on core benefits and services. Again, the three areas of spending that we're looking at are basic assistance, work-related activities for needy families, and childcare. And so this threshold would kick in FY17, and it would be 55%. And 55% of a state's TANF family assistance grant and their basic MOE, including the additional funding. So taking into account that new funding, the threshold or the floor would be set at 55%. And this floor would gradually increase incrementally up to 60% in 2021. But also keep in mind that each year there are additional new federal resources that would be flowing to states as the floor increases. And so again, the focus really is here with increased resources, moving toward an increased focus on economic stability and employment and the kinds of benefits and services that we think can best help families move out of poverty. And then going to the next slide, another piece of our proposal around refocusing the program on economic stability and employment. We say in our budget proposal that we want to encourage a better accountability structure for TANF that focuses on helping families get jobs, keep jobs, and make progress in the labor market. And this is something we've heard loud and clear from many stakeholders, and including many of the folks on the phone. Many of you were here in D.C. in September for our Gateway to Opportunity Conference, and this was a big topic of discussion. So we know there's a lot of interest from from a really diverse group of stakeholders in moving the program more in this direction. And at the same time, we recognize there's also a lot of interest and ability for increased flexibility to develop the kinds of individualized approaches that we hear from many of you that you need and want to work with families with the most serious barriers to employment. And in addition, to be able to effectively coordinate TANF with other state as well as tribal workforce efforts under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So we understand there's some active discussions. As you all know, there was a discussion draft in the House Ways and Means Committee last year that looked at some of these issues, and we understand there are active conversations happening in Congress. And so we look forward to working with Congress on these issues in particular. So then moving to another related issue, the issue of children in poverty. What you see on the graph on this slide is you see the child poverty rate with the bars in the background, and you see that this has fluctuated over the last 3 decades, and you can see that there was a sharp increase during the years of the Great Recession. But what you see in contrast, if you follow the blue line, is that since TANF replaced AFDC, it hasn't been particularly responsive to economic downturns, and in fact, as child poverty has increased, overall, the share of children in poverty who are receiving access to TANF assistance has declined quite dramatically. On the next slide, on a related issue, what's depicted here is the share of eligible families who are receiving AFDC or TANF for the most of the graph. And what you see is that the share of families receiving cash assistance declined from a high of 79% in 1996 at the end of AFDC down to just 32% in 2012. And so we know that less than a third of eligible families are currently receiving cash assistance from TANF. So going to the next slide, taking a look at that data, what we propose to respond to this issue is to really increase the focus of the program on addressing child and family poverty. And so our proposal would require that all TANF and MOE expenditures be for needy families, defined as families with incomes at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. And that would be coupled with adding a new purpose, an explicit purpose for the TANF program around child poverty reduction, which I think might seem obvious to a lot of people, but we think it's important enough that we ought to make that explicit and put it out there that it is the focus of the program. And related to that, we're proposing that HHS have the related data collection authority that we would need to be able to track progress on these measures, in particular to track state-by-state progress on how we're doing as a nation in reducing child poverty. And then the last piece here is something I think that will look quite familiar to many of you. It's been in the President's budget proposal for the last 2 years. And this would be a provision to prohibit states from claiming non-governmental third-party expenditures as maintenance of effort as MOE spending. And this is really, this spending is spending that's not really, it's not public dollars, it's not dollars spent by states, it's in fact private dollars that are spent by nonprofits and foundations, which actually has the result of states reducing their effort and reducing public spending to address child and family poverty. So going to the next slide, I mentioned wanting to build on evidence. And what we know about the current contingency fund, which is intended to be responsive in economic downturns, has not in fact functioned that way. And so building on the evidence and the experience that we have from under ARA, under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act post-recession, under that act, there was a TANF emergency fund that was created, and we learned a lot from that. There were a large number of both Republican and Democratic governors that took advantage of these resources. And so building on the success of that fund, we're proposing to replace the current contingency fund with targeted countercyclical funding. And this would be new money that would be available to states and tribes. It would be up to $2 billion over 5 years. And so I mentioned $10 billion total. $8 billion would be for an increase in the block grants. The other $2 billion is for the TANF Economic Response Fund. And the idea would be to tie this fund to a more effective trigger that's tied to unemployment, with the idea that this could be more responsive to downturns in the economy. And similar to the emergency fund under ARA, the allowable uses of these resources would be threefold. It would be for basic assistance, for subsidized employment, and for non-recurrent short-term benefits. the same uses that were allowable under the Emergency Fund. And the reason for this particular focus is we wanted to tie it to those kinds of activities that make most sense during a recession when jobs may not be as plentiful. And so what are the best things that we can do to help stabilize families, but then also help to quickly connect them to employment? Okay, and then so I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we're interested in supporting evidence-based approaches, but we also want to leave room for supporting innovation. And so we're proposing to repurpose the current contingency fund dollars to a couple of different initiatives. The first one, again, I think will sound very familiar. It's been in the President's budget proposal for the last couple of years. Last year, it was for the Pathways to Jobs initiative. We had proposed $573 million. We've actually taken that down to $473 million this year to support states and tribes to provide subsidized jobs to low-income parents as well as to youth. And again, this builds on some successful efforts of states and tribes, but we know there's a lot of interest in doing this, but states and tribes have found this challenging to do more of without new resources. So that's part of the rationale for that proposal. And then new this year, we're pretty excited about this. We're proposing a $100 million two-generation demonstration project. And this would be for competitive grants to both states and tribes for coordinated efforts that focus simultaneously on frontal employment outcomes and child and family well-being outcomes. This is a top priority, as many of you know, for the Office of Family Assistance. And it really builds on efforts that a number of states, as well as some tribes, have in place now. In particular, we have a number of states, Connecticut, Colorado, Washington, and Utah, that are part of OFA's Systems of Family Stability Policy Academy that have, as part of their action plans, piloted these kinds of approaches, and we think there's a lot of promise. And so this would be an investment in innovation as well as an evaluation to document what works. And then rounding out this proposal, this is again similar to the last couple of years. We're proposing $15 million for welfare research and then $10 million for the Census Bureau for the SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation. So that's $25 million total you see in the third bullet. And then finally, we're again proposing $10 million for program improvement initiatives, including technical assistance for both states and tribes for monitoring, research, and evaluation. So that was a lot of information at a high level. So just to sort of sum up the proposal and hit the highlights again, overall, what our proposal would do would increase the TANF block grant by $8 million over 5 years. It would set a minimum threshold for spending on core benefits and services. It would add child poverty reduction as an explicit purpose of the TANF program. It would limit federal TANF and state MOE spending to be focused on needy families, on low-income families. It would recognize the need for a better accountability system focused on helping families get and keep jobs. And it would allocate $2 billion in new money over 5 years for a TANF economic response fund. And then finally, repurposing the current contingency fund for Pathways to Jobs, two-generation demonstration projects, research and program improvement. So that was a lot of information. If you didn't manage to capture all of it, have no fear, because we are recording the webinar. It'll be available, and we also should later today have a fact sheet summarizing all of this available on the OFA website. And for those of you that want more details, because I know you will, the complete congressional justification for the budget proposal is available on the Administration for Children and Families website now. So you can go to that. Before we go to questions, which I'm thinking we probably already have some coming in, I wanted to mention one more proposal that's actually part of the President's budget, but it's separate from TANF, but I think it will be of interest to many of you. And that is a proposal it's not within TANF, but it certainly builds on the experience of TANF. And some of you may have seen the media coverage around this because OMB Director Sean Donovan announced it a couple of weeks ago. And this is a new initiative, which is called the Emergency Aid and Service Connection Grants Pilot. It's a pretty significant proposal. It proposes $2 billion over 5 years for competitive grants to state and local governments, which could also include tribes. And it's for emergency aid and for connecting families in crisis to longer-term support. And this proposal is really in response to some of the data that I shared earlier in the webinar, which is we know that there are a large number of families in poverty, families with children who are living on the edge, who aren't connected to TANF or perhaps other programs. This was well documented in the past year. Many of you have probably seen the book, or at least the media coverage around the book, $2 a Day. But it's certainly also well documented by research that we at ACF and others have funded, looking at families who are living in deep poverty, or are living on very little or no cash income, and are really in dire straits. And we know that this is a population we need and want to do more to reach. And so, and it's an area and a space where we know that there's a need and interest in more innovation. And so this would make competitive grants available to state and local governments to really try and test some new things and build the evidence around what works. And again, this would be $2 billion in new resource. So it's a pretty exciting proposal. And again, if you're interested in more details on that particular proposal, there's an entire chapter in the budget that provides more information on that. Okay, so now I think we are ready to go to questions.
Sure. Thanks, Nisha. It was a great presentation. I'm Lisa Washington Thomas, and I have a few questions that have come through the computer. We want a clarification. When you talk about poverty measures, are you talking about official poverty measures or supplemental poverty measures?
So that is a great question. And that is something that would, if this were to move forward, would need to be worked out. There are a number of different ways that we could look at child poverty, and I think that it comes up in a few places in our proposal. So it comes up in looking at, what would the formula be for distributing new resources, for example. And we know there's more than one way to cut that, and so I think that's certainly an area for further discussion, and we look forward to feedback from all of you about what you feel like the impact would be in your particular community.
Okay. Second, follow-up question. When you talk about this, is it in reference to the allocation of the additional funding only?
On the child poverty? That's correct. So the existing state family assistance grants and the tribal grants, the existing formula would remain for that original $6.5 billion. That would only be for the new and increased additional resources that we're proposing to look at child poverty.
Okay. In regards to the work-related activity spending of 6.8%, is there, which is the national average, are there states that are spending more than that, and are there any measurable results that have been seen?
That is a great question. And so I mentioned on our website that if you go to our homepage, which we encourage all of you to do, we do have state-by-state analysis. And there's a pretty wide range. So there are definitely states that are spending more than that on work-related activities. Significantly, I would, would shout out to Alaska, to Washington State, to Utah. Those are some of the states that come to mind that I know are spending significantly more in work-related activities. And in terms of results, states are doing a variety of things. And so, I can't say that it's more spending is always correlated in better results, but I think a lot of that depends on the kind of strategies that states are using and the kind of work they're doing to engage families. So there are some strategies that we know the research tells us do a better job of connecting families to employment and leading to economic stability. For example, career pathways programs and subsidized jobs are two strategies that we've seen states have success with.
Okay. Next one's an easy question. Will the PowerPoint be available?
I'll let Lisa answer that.
Yes, the PowerPoint will be available, as well as we are recording this webinar because we did have a request for some of our most western states who would not be able to get on at this time. And we will, as soon as they are meet the 508 compliance regulations, we will be posting those on the OFA and the PTA website.
And I would just add to that, we hope that we'll have a fact sheet up that has a lot of the same information more quickly. So it could be as soon as this afternoon, and if not this afternoon, very shortly thereafter.
We have one more question coming up. If someone can, for the minimum spending on core benefits, will there be a cap for each one or cumulative?
The way it's proposed now, it would be cumulative.
Okay. One of the more effective triggers for the contingency fund, do you anticipate relaxing the 100% MOE requirement?
Yeah, that's not something that we go into specific detail in the budget proposal, and so I think that's something we'd be interested in hearing from states, your thoughts about that.
questions are still coming in, so I don't know if we want to be patient and see who else is typing.
It's early in a lot of places, so we'll give people a little time.
Nisha, I have a question. Sure. So you talk about the demonstration grants that might be coming. Will they only be for states, or can counties apply? Or is that something we have to think about later?
So for the two-generation demonstration projects, those are framed specifically for states and for tribes. Certainly they could be in partnership with local communities. And then I mentioned at the end of the presentation the Emergency Aid and Service Connection grants. So those are framed specifically for state and local governments, and so we do anticipate that counties would be able to apply for those resources, as well as governments could partner with local nonprofits on their proposals around that.
Okay. Well, that looks like all the questions we have at this time.
Lisa, there's actually two more in there.
So, Damon, maybe you can read them for us. We're having some technical difficulties here.
One just came in. Would the state family assistance grants and the tribal family assistance grants still be based on FY1994 caseload figures and data?
Yeah, so the proposal doesn't currently make any changes to that formula. The focus really is on the new money and tying the new money to child poverty.
And one more just came in. Will tribes be eligible for contingency funds?
So with the contingency fund, we've actually proposed, so the current, let me distinguish two things. The current contingency fund, we've proposed repurposing that for a couple of demonstration innovation projects. And tribes would explicitly be eligible to apply for both the Pathways to Job Initiative grants, as well as the competitive two-generation demonstration projects. And then for the TANF Emergency Response Fund, that is proposed to be modeled after the emergency fund that was available under ARA, and under ARA, both states and tribes were eligible.
And no one else is typing, so I think that was the last question.
Okay, well, thanks, everyone. If you had a question and it didn't get answered, you certainly feel free to follow up with us. We're you know how to find us, I think, us here in D.C., but also our regional program managers around the country who are, I know, often your first point of contact for both our tribal and state grantees. We look forward to engaging in more discussion with you about the budget as the next weeks and months unfold. And we know you all have a lot of good ideas because we've heard from you about them, and I hope that you at least see some of them reflected in this proposal, and we'll look forward to more continued discussion with you. We've got, we'll have coming up this summer some regional convenings, and that'll be a place for us to get a chance to meet face-to-face and, you know, hear directly from you more about what you're seeing on the ground and how you think this proposal would play out. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy President's Day. And we look forward to being in touch.
Thank you very much, Nisha. An evaluation will be appearing on your screen. Please take a few moments to complete it so that OFA can continue to provide responsive technical assistance to stakeholders, and then have a great rest of your day.